Okay, it's very distracting for me, but all right. Hi, welcome. First, just want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Kate Stryker, and I want to welcome the audience, which is on Zoom. We are also streaming this live on YouTube. There's a weird echo for me, so if I seem distracted, I'm sorry. So this is our second public meeting for the Midtown Thriving Project. It's really distracting. Sorry, I'm trying to get rid of the echo. Anyway, so welcome. We had our first meeting, our kickoff meeting on April 10th, about a month ago. I think some of you were there. I recognize faces, but for those of you who were not, I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the project today. But quickly, I just want to make an announcement for anyone who's here in person that we have Spanish language interpretation services, and those are being provided by Jenny McCormick and Yamaris Renelt. Yamaris, do you want to come see that?
Buenas noches, para informarles que tenemos servicios de interpretación en español.
So our agenda for today is we're going to have a panel discussion about brownfields in Midtown. I will introduce our panelists in a moment here. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the project, the Midtown Thriving Project, and then we're going to go over some of our early findings from the inventory and analysis of the BOA study area. And then we will have time for questions and answers at the end. And we will also have time for questions and answers from the panelists immediately following the panel. So our project team includes Bartek Starodai from the City of Kingston, Susan Landfried from the Department of State. She's managing the grant. And then Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress is the consultant. And from Pattern for Progress, we have Adam Bosch, Robin DeGroat, Elka Godfried, Eric Pearson, Yasmin Aziz, and myself. I'm Kate Stryker. We also have a committee that is working for this project. I just want to give thanks to the committee. The committee guides the planning process, they offer technical assistance, and they keep us informed about what is happening in the community. So to begin, just for people who were not here in the first meeting, what is a brownfield? Because this is a project that does involve brownfields, and we're going to have a discussion briefly about brownfields. So a brownfield is land that is known or suspected to have environmental contamination. Typically, a brownfield is a brownfield because of former uses of the site. So it could have been used for industry, gas stations, and auto body shops, dry cleaners, or others. And there's many negative impacts from brownfields. So they can pose environmental hazards, community health risks. The land can remain vacant or underutilized, contributes to feelings of unsafety, and discourages investment in the area. So the state has what's known as a Brownfield Opportunity Area Planning Program. And this is assistance for the development of a community-based plan to develop a community-led vision for the neighborhood, create development concepts for select vacant and underutilized sites, support the remediation and redevelopment of select brownfields and other vacant sites into productive uses that meet community needs, develop other action, policy, and investment recommendations for the neighborhood, and this all results in a designated brownfield opportunity area plan. So I went into a lot of detail about this in our last meeting. There is a recording of that meeting. If you're interested in learning more about any of this, that's available on the website for this project, which you can access on the Engage Kingston website. You go to Engage Kingston and then you just search Midtown Thriving, and there's a recording where we speak a lot more about all of this. There's a lot of benefits to this planning process. First, it's an opportunity for community building because it brings people together. The designation of a BOA The Brownfield Opportunity Area demonstrates community support for certain development, which can lead to expediency and reduced investment risk. There's tax credits to offset the cost of remediation and encourage redevelopment of brownfield properties. And redevelopment can lead to the creation of new housing, job opportunities, and other community benefits. Cleanup of environmental contamination in the neighborhood and reduction of public health risks. So I realize I'm going through this quickly, but I want to just get to the panel, and this is just a little background. There's other benefits to this program, including there's state funding for planning around environmental, housing, and economic conditions and doing studies on these topics, building conditions, infrastructure, renewable energy. There's also funding for professional services for development strategies, zoning, and regulatory updates, legal and financial services, and public outreach. This, for those of you who have not seen this map yet, is the Brownfield Opportunity Area Study Area. And we're going to talk more about this in a few minutes, but just wanted to give you a sense of the area that we're talking about. This area was, so in 2019, the county did a pre-nomination study. And they came up with this area based on the fact that there was the highest concentration of vacant and underutilized sites in Ulster County in this neighborhood. It also includes some significant transportation infrastructure, the rail, and other transportation infrastructure, including the Greenway Trail. It's also where the Midtown Arts District is. And if you have questions about this area, please come and talk to me afterwards. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we have Amanda Laval, the Deputy County Executive of Ulster County, Kaylin E. Lochi from Weston and Sampson, and Kiera Thompson from the Department of Environmental Conservation. Amanda was with the city, so she wasn't with the city, but she was with the county when the county got, when the city got a grant from EPA in 2018 to do environmental assessment of some sites in the city, including in Midtown. Kaylin is with Weston and Sampson, and they are the consultant that did that environmental assessment. And Kiera Thompson is the section chief for our region in the state, and she oversees the cleanup programs that DEC manages. So the questions that I have for the panelists have actually come directly from the public. So we've began our community outreach. I've started to hear questions about contamination in the neighborhood. And so in response to those questions, we organized this panel today to hear from the experts about this question. This panel is going to last about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the public. We're hoping to end this portion of the meeting by around 7, and then we're going to move into looking at some of those early existing conditions findings that I mentioned already. Okay. Sure. You want to introduce yourself, or I have questions for you? Very thrown by that. Might be better. It's fine. All right. Yeah, that's much better. So the first question for the panelists, should I introduce? Okay, is what is the known contamination in the neighborhood? And I'm going to let you all just sort of respond to that. I think starting with Amanda.
Good evening, everybody. I've worked for Ulster County for quite a while, including in both the planning and the environment department. So I'm really gonna get close to this mic. And I was involved with the environmental assessment for the rail yard in between Cornell Street and O'Neill Street, which is now like an open air part of the Midtown Linear Park. But if folks remember, was a pretty junky rail yard that was kind of fenced off for a long time in that area. What was that? Okay, sorry about that. We're still trying to iron this out, so please just hands up if there's a problem with the audio. So I have probably the most narrow knowledge of any of this panel. These folks are far more knowledgeable than I am. But I can tell you just from being involved with the environmental assessment for that former rail yard, which is now part of the Midtown Linear, and some other parcels kind of in the neighborhood, that we were primarily looking at like metals in the ground that were consistent with old industrial kind of activities, and also some degree of like old fuel, like maybe some spilled diesel or gasoline or oil on the surface of the soil, and some degree of solvents, particularly two called PCE and TCE. And I'm going to leave it to these folks to spell that out for you, what those stand for, what those abbreviations stand for. But those were a little bit deeper, and those were in the groundwater in the neighborhood. But typically what we were looking at was pretty consistent with what you would see in a junkyard, which was metals and some degree of kind of oil or fuel.
Thank you. Again, my name is Kaylin Lochi, and I'm with Weston Sampson. We're an engineering firm that was hired by the city back in 2018 to help with the engineering and environmental services under their EPA community-wide assessment grant. So we did some assessment work throughout Kingston, but we focused on the waterfront as well as some sites in the Midtown district. So we had, I believe, 5 or 6 sites in Midtown where we did what's called a phase 1 assessment, which is basically a review of historical records. We review online databases, state databases, federal databases to see what kind of spills or releases have occurred in the area. We also look at historical records to determine what the sites have been used for. We do a site visit as part of the phase 1 to see what the current conditions are. And this is all to identify environmental conditions, recognized environmental conditions. So we conducted the phase 1s on, I believe, like I said, six sites. Most of them were residential houses, and then one was 615 Broadway. Based on our findings during the phase 1s, we then recommended a phase 2, which is the actual sampling of soil or groundwater on a site. So we ended up doing 4 phase 2s, 3 on residential houses on Franklin Street, and then also the 615 Broadway. So the residential houses, obviously they had been residential, historically. There was never any kind of on-site manufacturing or industrial uses, dry cleaning, anything like that. 615 Broadway was historically residential starting, I think, in the 1880s, and then they developed a motel there in the 1970s. So again, that site really did not have a history of high-risk environmental uses such as industrial or manufacturing. So when we did the phase 2s, we collected soil samples, shallow soil samples within the first 2 feet. And then deeper soil samples down to about 25 feet. We also collected groundwater samples at each of the sites. So for the residential properties, the highest or the contaminants that came back were mostly lead. And I think that was from lead-based paint on the houses that kind of chipped away and got into the soils. And we really only found those in the shallow soils. We also found the TC and PC in the groundwater at those sites also, which obviously did not come from these residential houses. There was no historic use of, chlorinated solvents at those. So PC and TC are chlorinated solvents that are typically associated with dry cleaning facilities or degreasing, processes, that type of thing. So the fact that we did not find it in the soil, but we found it in the groundwater indicated that there was some kind of off-site source. And for 615 Broadway, we also found some metals in the shallow soils as well as some SVOCs, which are semi-volatile organic compounds, typically associated with, petroleum products, that type of thing. But they were very low levels of both the metals and the SVOCs. And again, they were only in the shallow soils. And we kind of chalk that up to, some urban fill. You typically see that in urban areas. So it wasn't surprising to find that. But we also found the PC and TC in the water there. Obviously, no history of that use on site. So again, coming from an off-site source. So that's what we found.
Hi, and just to remind you, I'm Kira Thompson. I'm a geologist with the Division of Environmental Remediation up in Albany. And the bureau I work in manages Region 3. Our Region 3 sites are basically the mid to lower Hudson Valley region. So in this area here, and I'm going to piggyback on what Kaylin said, a lot of the we manage several sites within this BOA area, and some of them are brownfield sites, which we can talk about later. I think there's questions about that later, but just going back to the contamination, we see the same things that Kaylin just talked about. We generally in this area, in any urban area, we'll see things like heavy metals in the soil, particularly lead from things, lead-based paints. And we also see what we call semi-volatile organic compounds, which are your petroleums, your fuel oils. That's just, everywhere in an urban environment. This area, however, has a lot of those chlorinated solvents, tetrachloroethylene, which is PCE, and trichloroethylene, which is TCE. We see those in almost all of the sites in this area that we manage with the state. And some of the areas, the levels are, pretty high. And we haven't had a chance to really track down all of the plumes. But I think the data thus far indicates that there may be several sources, which is not unusual in an urban area. You can drive down the street and see where several dry cleaners are presently or have been. Any sort of manufacturing where they're working with metal, they'll use these solvents to degrease. And so nothing surprising, but still above what we manage as far as cleanup standards go. So with that being said, many of these sites in this area will qualify for management under our program in the Brownfield Cleanup Program.
All right, so we sort of heard about how the area was contaminated and when it was contaminated. I mean, it sort of happened over decades, depending on the different uses. It could have been from a dry cleaner or factories in some cases, or in the 615 Grand, it was just sort of the fill, the urban fill that was used. So I guess the next question is, what remediation of sites in Midtown has already occurred? And then the follow-up is, what remediation is likely to be needed in Midtown? And I don't know if Amanda wanted to answer this or if I should go straight to Kira.
Very quickly on the Midtown. I think I'm going to speak again about the Midtown site, the rail site, where the Midtown Linear Park is now. So it's that bigger open space between Cornell Street and O'Neill Street. And some of the remediation depends on what your future use is of that site. So for that site, we knew we wanted to keep an open site. We weren't planning on doing any buildings. So what we were able to do was just remove 1 to 2 feet of soil from the site and bring in new fill on top of it. So really what we were concerned about as far as our uses went was that soil on top. Although we've all mentioned, and we did find some of those solvents in the groundwater. The groundwater is about, I would say, 15 to 20 feet below the surface in that part of the city. So we weren't, again, and we know that everybody's on municipal water. We're not concerned about folks drawing well water or drinking it. So that wasn't the concern for our particular use as far as just having an open park area.
So there are, as I said earlier, several sites that the state manages under our various cleanup programs. And we have several sites that have been through a voluntary program, either the voluntary cleanup program, which has since been sunsetted, replaced by now the brownfield cleanup program. So there are what we call, BCP sites, VCP sites, but we also have a site in this Midtown area called 25 Field Court, and that is currently listed as a Class 2 on our inactive hazardous waste facility registry. And a Class 2 means that it has we've deemed it a significant threat to health or the environment. And this site is currently undergoing some legal negotiations between the responsible party and my department. And after such time, we hope to have someone step up, either ourselves or a volunteer, to come in and clean up under our oversight. And in some sense, we have several different levels of cleanup that can be achieved for particular site use, reasonably anticipated future use of the site. And they can range from unrestricted. In the brownfield program, we call that track 1. That means that there's no limitations on how that site may be used in the future. Then we have residential restrictions, restricted residential restrictions, commercial and industrial restrictions, and they have various levels of what is allowed for use. I'll just say on the side here that a lot of the projects we see come through the brownfield cleanup program generally are going for housing. Usually a mixed use residential use is what has been in demand and what we've seen. With a lot of those sites, we always want to achieve the highest level of cleanup we can. So we always encourage unrestricted cleanup or track 1 cleanups. And in the brownfield program, that's awarded through tax credits, which I think we'll probably talk about more in a minute. But the mixed use residential structure or development can also be have commercial businesses inside. So you probably are familiar with those new developments you see all over the place now, which have housing in the top floors, and on the bottom there's some retail. That's like usually what we see come through the most frequently nowadays. We also have a few sites that have gotten to a completion with us. That doesn't mean that the site is done and that we're done with it. If there's an unrestricted use that's been attained, then we are done with it. The site is closed and there's no need for any further management or monitoring. Typically though, sites will go into a cleanup program anticipating that they won't be able to really achieve our strict unrestricted cleanup levels. So they clean up to the use that is most feasible, and that can result in long-term site management, and sometimes something called an environmental easement is placed on the parcel. And that just limits the site use. Maybe it'll limit the groundwater usage of the site. and also maintain our controls that we have placed on the site for the benefit of health and the environment.
So you anticipated my next question, which was, what can a brownfield be redeveloped as? But I don't know if you want to sort of drive that point home.
Just going back to briefly what I said about the different levels of cleanup that we allow in the program. I also said that most of the time we see these mixed-use residential redevelopments. That seems to be the most popular thing. I know housing shortages across the country, and developers see an opportunity there. We have seen everything you can imagine as far as a result of a brownfield program cleanup. We've seen residential properties go through it. Let's say a residential, a person with wants to sell their residential property, but there's a problem environmentally, so they come to us as a volunteer in our program, and we will work with them to clean the parcel up, and then they have a liability release, and then they're more able to, say, secure funding or to process a sale more smoothly. We also see industrial or commercial properties come in. Maybe they want to build onto their parcel. Maybe they want to come into a vacant parcel and develop a commercial business, or even a manufacturing business, which is industrial use. And then I guess the most, as I said, the most common one I'll see, and probably what I would anticipate in Kingston, is housing. And typically that's, either a residential or a restricted residential use, which has different cleanup levels that they must achieve in order to get what we call a certificate of completion.
I just want to take a moment too, because the field court site is currently under investigation. So that process is just kind of starting, and they're still trying to better understand what's going on there and what the remediation would be. But I also want to just let folks know that there are other sites in Midtown that have had, remediation. And if folks are familiar with the building where Always There Moving and Storage is now, that was formerly, I believe, Huck Manufacturing. That also had a lot of these chlorinated solvents, PCE and TCE, and had a lot of them under, in a plume around that property. And it went through a DEC program. And there are, of course, again, if you're familiar with that particular block, there are single family residential, quite a few blocks deep on at least two sides. And then it's bordered by the tracks, and then by, I want to say Smith Ave on the other side, kind of where the post office is. And there was some remediation that was done for those single family homes, kind of on that face the site on the one side. For those types of solvents, what I believe the DEC is most worried about is what's called soil vapor intrusion. So it's where these chemicals kind of come up through the soil and can get into the enclosed living space. And then folks, even if they're not aware of it, they're breathing them in to some extent. So if you drive down that block, you can actually look towards the back of the buildings, and you'll see something that looks like almost like a huge dryer vent, right, coming out of up the back side of the house. And those are negative pressure systems that are installed under, the foundation or around the foundation, really similar to a radon system, to get those vapors out from underneath the foundation before they get into the house. So there are examples in Midtown where these types of plumes have been mapped out in the past and have been remediated.
I'm just going to jump in to say that is very much really the driver for health exposures, is that soil vapor intrusion, and the fact that you're directly inhaling some harmful chemicals. That's something that the DEC takes very seriously. And when we even have a reason to believe that might be occurring, we go out and do our own studies in areas around, say, a site that has a groundwater problem that has these volatile chemicals in it. We will then go out and make sure and do surveys and sample in the homes or businesses surrounding or on top of that groundwater plume. Our health department has established guidance that I think you and any other environmental professional in the state is very familiar with. You can find that on the New York State Department of Health website. It is very prescribed steps and ways to mitigate soil vapor concerns in different structures. And I know for 25 Field Court, we understand that there is a groundwater issue, and we have already begun doing offsite assessments to determine if there are soil vapor intrusion concerns in buildings around there.
All right, the next question is for probably Kiara. It is, what is a brownfield tax credit? So as I mentioned in the introduction, after the area is designated as a BOA, developers are able to access what's known as a bump up on a tax credit. So it's an additional tax credit they can get if their development conforms with the community vision. So sort of just what is a tax credit so we understand what that is.
Yeah, sure. So the Brownfield program incentivizes volunteers to come in and clean up their sites for many reasons, and returning parcel on underutilized parcels back into something viable and back onto the tax rolls. But there are other incentives that are very attractive to people that are looking into maybe building something or redeveloping a parcel. And these tax credits are available upon closure. We provide something called a certificate of completion when the cleanup has been performed to our satisfaction. And when I mentioned earlier the different levels of cleanup, the more strictly, the more strict the cleanup, so let's say that track 1 or unrestricted cleanup has been achieved, they get the highest number of tax credits. So tax credits are awarded at the end of the project, and they are based on the cost of the project. There are site prep costs that includes demolition or abatement of structures, and site preparation such as remedial investigation, and also includes the cost to actually remediate the site. That takes into account things like the total volume of soils that they had to remove from the parcel. All of that is calculated. Then they, so that's part of the tax credit makeup. But as you mentioned, Kate, there are other what we call gateways to achieve higher cleanups. So going back to the cleanup, the standards that we use for site use. If you're going to go for an industrial cleanup, which is the easiest cleanup to achieve, you're going to have the lowest base tax credit. And then it goes up the scale to the unrestricted, which has the most. Then there's the gateways I just mentioned. If you have an underutilized property, which most brownfields by definition are, if you are in a BOA, a brownfield opportunity area, you get additional tax credits. So it makes redeveloping in a BOA area more attractive because they could result in higher credits. There are credits for affordable housing, credits for renewable energy. So if you have let's say we have an old landfill that is just sitting there, but somebody comes in and says, you know what, I think I want to put a solar farm on that. They can enter the brownfield program. We can redevelop that, and they're subject to tax credits because of that gateway. There was something else I was going to say, but I forgot, and I'm sure we'll end zones. Yes, end zone is, sorry. End zones are areas that have been designated by the New York State Department of State that meet certain demographics for what they call an environmental zone. The Department of State could probably speak more to how that's established, but we look at environmental zones or end zones as another incentive, another bump up in the total tax credits. Oh, I did remember. There's also another component to the tax credits. I talked about the site prep. There's also something called tangible property tax credits. That's the other half of the equation here, and that is credits that are awarded for the total cost of the redevelopment. So if you're coming in and just, maybe demoing a building and putting in a parking lot, your tangible tax credits are not going to be huge. But if you're going to put in a giant high rise, then you might be awarded some decent tangible property credits. And just as a side note, there have been several iterations of the brownfield cleanup program over the years. And one of the recent reforms was that New York City is no longer eligible for tangible tax credits unless very certain conditions are met. So they're still going in Region 3.
So my final question before we open it up to questions from the audience is, and again, these questions are from the public. What are the DEC cleanup programs? And I think you're going to want me to change slides.
Oh, yeah. We have several programs that are, I can show, we can talk about, if you go to the next one. This is a very simplified flow chart as to how our brownfield cleanup program works. And it is based on our class 2 cleanup, state superfund cleanups, which is a different, I can talk about that in a second. But the general components are application, eligibility determination, which is met, we all meet on a committee and we decide whether or not an application is viable for entrance into the program. Then we go through something called a remedial investigation. This is defining the nature and extent of all of the contamination at the site. Then the state, we issue a decision document after a remedial action work plan is submitted. And I think in this slide, anything in I think is how it is. Anything in dark font indicates a public participation component, which are usually fact sheets and sometimes comment periods. So after this decision document is issued, which lays out the remedy that has been decided upon between the volunteer participant and the state, we go into remedial action, which is when the cranes and the excavators come out and they clean up the site, and then the consultant or the applicant provides us what's called a final engineering report. That engineering report is important because it goes through everything done on the environmental side of the site. And we reviewed that in the Division of Environmental Remediation, and we determined whether or not it's achieved the goals of cleanup. Once that is approved by the DEC, then they are granted a certificate of completion. And then after that, depending on the level of cleanup, they may have long-term site management to address. And that usually looks like, monitoring or maintaining any engineering controls such as a site cover to reduce exposures, or long-term monitoring of groundwater. That's a common one, or maintenance of the soil vapor or subslab depressurization system or other mitigation system to prevent soil vapor contamination coming into breathing areas inside someone's structure.
Thank you. So I have one more question. So why is there a tax credit? I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the costs of remediation and how why that even exists.
Sure. I like to look at the brownfield program as a marriage of between environmental cleanup, which is what our business is, and economic redevelopment. So this was a way that, some of our lawmakers decided that was a good way to incentivize people to come in and take some of these parcels that may not be attractive to redevelopers because they don't want to build on something that may have contamination, and provide them with an incentive such as tax credits to turn these brownfields into greenfields. So the tax credit is really there to, attract developers, businesses, owners to perform the cleanups that are needed on these parcels and then turn them into something viable.
All right, so we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and this includes the audience who's watching on Zoom. And so if anyone has a question, just raise your hand and I will come over to the mic. You have to speak into the mic so that the audience on Zoom is able to hear your question.
Hi, I have a question about you said you were looking at 25 Field Court already, and like, so if you find offsite soil vapor intrusion out in an area, does that just become part of the plan for the remediation for 25 Field Court? And then also, like, how do you know when to stop looking? If you find it, do you only look in 100 feet or?
Really, really good questions. So when we have a site, I think we have maybe a figure that we can go back to when we have a site come into a program, we have a site boundary that is designated initially. Usually it reflects a tax property parcel. Then we go into when we investigate, our purpose is to delineate the nature and extent of contamination. So our remedial investigation is not complete until we absolutely understand the edge of the contaminant plume. And that's for all media, vapor, groundwater, soil. For 25 Field Court, as an example, we know chlorinatids are a problem and they are volatile. And we know that volatile compounds tend to, go up into the pore spaces of soil and then further into, inside structures. So what we'll do there is if we have what we call a responsible party designated, that is somebody who our council's office determines who is either responsible for the contamination or has inherited the contamination. Sometimes you can have innocent responsible parties, unfortunately, but that's how the law is written. We try to get them to do the cleanup. And there's orders on consent that we try to have them sign with us, that we always offer that. If we have trouble getting someone under a consent order and it's a significant threat site, like 25 Field Court is, then we are authorized to use state superfunds to address any contamination there. So we have the ability to unlock that money to do this, but we have to go through certain steps before we can do that. With that being said, for a site like 25 Field Court, we have a responsible party on the hook right now. We're trying to negotiate with them. But we know that the air issue, the vapor issue can go off site. So we can use state superfunds to step out and look around, investigate other properties. That's in the brownfield program too. We have volunteers and we have participants. Volunteers are innocent owners or innocent developers that come in and say, we're going to do something good with this parcel. We also have participants who come in and say, you know what, I messed up. I am responsible for this. I want to, clean it up. And there's whole sorts of intricacies between what a volunteer and a participant is. But a volunteer is not obligated to go off site and chase a contamination plume. We, unfortunately, at DEC, we're allowed to tap into those state superfunds to address any off-site plumes from these brownfield volunteer programs. The participant side of the brownfield program, they are obligated to clean up off-site. They are obligated to chase and investigate and remediate any off-site contamination. But as a department goes, we will never let something like that go if we are aware of it. We follow up.
I just want to add on to that if you or your neighbors receives a notice or a letter from maybe State Department of Health, or I don't know if it's DOH or DEC about testing, it is to do that kind of assessment of where that edge is of the plume. So please encourage folks to let them in to do the testing, because I know years back with a preliminary round with Field Court, we were having neighbors who wouldn't allow the state in to do the testing. And then sometimes they're rental properties, sometimes they're owner occupied, but the owner is fearful. But this is not about finding out something on their property that's their responsibility. It's really it's a health issue and it has to relate with this other property investigation.
Thank you for that distinction. It's really important that we get into structures. Otherwise, we really have no way to help. If we do get into a structure, we get the access to go in and we test and we find that we do have to mitigate some issues, those are at no cost to the homeowner. That's something that we do. We use state super funds to mitigate any of those any of those problems. So it is, I highly encourage anyone, if you get that notice, let them in, let them sample.
So I have two questions. One is, are there possible other sites? Because I'm wondering why you picked those particular homes. I mean, many of us live in residential areas, so I'm wondering why were these homes picked? And secondly, when you talk about these chemical plumes in the groundwater, is Kingston on an aquifer? I mean, could this be a problem in different parts of the city? You know, I'm just kind of at sea here about the risk if you live somewhere in Midtown, even if you're not next to what obviously was a factory. You know, are there, do the plumes move, and how would you know?
I can answer your question about why those homes were chosen. At least under our program with the EPA, a lot of them were vacant and underutilized properties. I believe the city was considering foreclosing on them, so they wanted to get assurance as to what the conditions were before they went ahead and foreclosed on them. I know the city at the time also had a Restore New York grant, so they had chosen some of the residential properties in particular so that they could not only do the assessments on them, but then after that, get an idea of can they be reused and use that Restore New York money in connection with the cleanup. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Ubiquitous. Yep.
And also, from the department's perspective, often we have suspicion of contamination that someone alerts us to, be it a spill or an investigation at a nearby property has found contamination that we believe might be emanating from another parcel nearby. Those are reported to us, and we designate them as P sites, preliminary sites. P sites also, we have the authority to spend state super funds to characterize those sites to determine if hazardous contaminants are present. If hazardous contaminants are present at a P site, then we can either list it on a registry or hope that someone enters the brownfield cleanup program with that information. So there are many ways we can find these sites.
I'm going to jump in too. Just as far as I think what I was hearing in your question, Lynn, was about the aquifer and about what those plumes might look like. I think the best just kind of description I read was that when you have, like, these solvents were great, people love them, they use them everywhere, the dry cleaners, like the degreasers at the corner, auto repair shop, the manufacturing, like they were very, very widely used. So those plumes can actually kind of overlap, they can envelop each other, and they can kind of morph around. However, they don't seem to like run miles, right? Oh goodness. Okay. So, uh, they, I don't think that they in Midtown that they are like miles long, those plumes. Like from what I've seen, that they're kind of discreet. Again, we sit on a whole lot of sand. The groundwater, I think, generally tends to go about that way, like southwest. But beyond that, I've never seen any kind of wells like kind of in a really big radius around the city.
Yeah, and one other thing is that the nature of these chlorinated volatile organic compounds is that they're denser than water and they're highly soluble. So they tend to sink down through the groundwater column and dissolve into plumes, which is why we can find them down gradient usually. Yeah. Yep. Right, but keep in mind that there's, I think the majority of, and please tell me if I'm wrong, the majority of Kingston is on supplied water. So there's no, you're not going to be drinking this water. This is just water that is under your feet, but could have environmental impacts.
And it's about 20 feet down. The groundwater is about 20 feet below surface. So, digging in your backyard to plant, you're not going to run into this. You won't be in contact with the groundwater.
Hey, it's unclear to me whether the unoccupied, underutilized and vacant lots will apply to some of these incentive programs, or if this is just an environmental situation.
Part of the BOA designation is to make these underutilized parcels more attractive to redevelopment. So, I mean, having a BOA in your city is phenomenal. It can make a huge difference in how those parcels are cleaned up and remediated and redeveloped. So, yeah, I don't know. Did you want to say?
But I'll answer your question. So in the BOA planning project for Midtown Thriving, not all of the sites will be known or suspected to be contaminated. Some of the sites may just be a parking lot that's very underutilized, or even there may be a structure that's being utilized but not, in the way that the community needs it to be. So not all of the sites will be contaminated. Under the grant, they do not need to be contaminated or even suspected to be contaminated. But this panel is because some of the sites are known to be contaminated, and we were receiving a lot of questions about that.
In reference to her question, can residents in Midtown, can they call and request testing for free?
Generally, if you suspect there might be an issue, we will assess that and come out and test if we think there is a potential for hazardous contamination to be affecting that property. Yep. It's free of charge to, yes, to residents. You would have to establish with the department some sort of evidence-based, like I saw this guy dumping something out down the drain in the backyard.
In her case, when she mentioned that, residents live next to auto shops, mechanic shops, could this be something that they can say, like, hey, I live next to an auto shop. I attended your meeting and I was very concerned about contamination in my area and I would like to get testing.
So for that, there's a couple different ways to approach that. The first is that if there's a suspected health problem, let's say you're on well water and you have something happening next door to you that you don't, like, and you want to know what's in your water, that is a request you can make from the Department of Health, and they will come and sample the water that you drink. For environmental concerns, you can alert us to some, sketchy things happening nearby, and we will come and look at it. If we, again, we have to determine whether or not, resources are best spent there. We will do our best to kind of gather information, and then we'll make a plan to go out and sample. It would not be for, a cost of an innocent owner would not, it would be nothing to them.
I have about two questions. One relates to the lady over here there with the blue hair, because I'm as confused as her about the entire program and whether it's a remediation program or also for sites which may not be contaminated but need to be revitalized. My question is, those sites which are not contaminated, is the incentive, if they go through this process, as well a tax reduction, and how big is the tax reduction, and how long will be there a tax reduction? And that's the same question for those with contamination, because they're cleaning up stuff they did not put into the soil. So, and a tax remediation as an incentive, I'm not sure how that should work, because when you construct, you shed out money up front until you actually have income. It'll maybe take 2 years or 3, and then you pay maybe taxes, and then you get some reduction. We all know that this is expensive. So maybe you can answer to that more pragmatically. So far, it was nice listening, but I would like to see numbers and math.
So to answer your very first question, in order to enter the brownfield cleanup program that the state administrates, you have to prove that is contamination on your parcel. So if you have nothing of concern there, we're not going to allow you into the program and all bets are off for that. That's another question he has about numbers and. I'm sorry, you wanted to ask about how you wanted numbers,
I think he wanted to understand
the tax
why.
credit structure. So if you come into the brownfield, if you're deemed eligible for the brownfield program, your tax credit is based on like this cost of your redevelopment, the cost of the cleanup, basically. Then you get a percentage of those costs as a tax credit. You have, I think, up to like 15 years to redevelop the parcel and claim your credit. But it's, hard to give you, there are tax tables that you can look at on the DEC's website. If you Google BCP tax credits, there's a table that goes through all of the conditions and what the base tax credit is for that condition. It's the best I can do. Tax and finance usually.
And I just, yeah, so,
Correct.
so there's sort of two questions I
For
think you're
brownfield.
asking. There's the sites in the BOA plan, which is the Midtown Thriving Project. And not all of those sites are going to be contaminated and need to go into the brownfield cleanup. So they don't get a tax credit, but they will still be part of the visioning process through the BOA planning project. And there's other benefits that they receive that potentially the neighborhood receives, but there's no tax credit specifically for those sites because there's no contamination. I'm going to move on just because one of our panelists needs to leave and I see a couple more questions and I just want to get to other questions. I'm happy to talk with you about this after the meeting if you'd like. And we have other people who can speak to this as well.
Hi, two questions. One with regards to 615 Broadway. What's the status of remediation at that site in particular? And then 25 Field Court, because this is a class 2 or level 2, would that mean that the existing structures would have to be demolished in order to get a certificate of remediation? That's the first question. And the second question is with regards to drinking water testing. Does that fall under the auspices of Ulster County Department of Health or New York State Department of Health?
Generally, our state health department coordinates with the county health departments, and they between themselves to determine who will go and do the testing. To answer that second question.
But there's no drinking water.
Yeah, here there's no private water wells to be concerned about. You're getting water from a source and distributed through the city that undergoes routine testing. Yeah. As far as 615 Broadway, is that the site you asked? This site just entered the BCP, the Brownfield Cleanup Program, under under the state. And it's going into what we call remedial investigation. So we don't really know a lot about that parcel yet. We know that contamination is present, and that's how they got into the program. But now we have to go through a formal investigation to determine, as I said earlier, the nature and extent of the contamination.
The lot, it's just the empty parking lot.
That building, so we're we're negotiating with the designated responsible party there. And Matt Ayers, he's the project manager for DEC. He can probably speak to, do you want to talk about what's present and you want to come up here with a mic or?
So just to answer your question, the building wouldn't necessarily need to be demolished. I don't know what the plans are specifically, but there has been site characterization that's been performed at that site, and there's known contamination under the slab, and there's known contamination in the groundwater. So like Kira said, it's in the process of, we're negotiating with the owner. And then after that is done, it'll likely proceed into full-blown remedial investigation and then cleanup, whether the owner does it or it goes into another program. I don't know yet.
All right, I want to thank our panelists. We're going to move on to the next part of this presentation today. But before we do, I want to just thank Amanda Laval, who needs to head out. Thank you, Amanda. So Kira brought in a couple example projects of redevelopment projects under the Brownfield Cleanup Project. So I'm going to let her just talk about those to kind of give you an idea of what can happen to a brownfield.
I only sent over a few examples. There are hundreds of brownfield cleanup success stories across New York State. Some of these are more of the dramatic examples that I quickly pulled out just to demonstrate what can result from a brownfield cleanup. This is a site in Long Island that underwent remediation for basically PCE, or the tetrachloroethylene, which is the same contaminant of concern that we are seeing in this Midtown BOA area. So on the left, you can see that was what it looked like in 2010. It was an underutilized parcel. They wanted to redevelop, so they entered the program. And then on the right, you can see they turned it into this beautiful condo development. And it's quite a nice improvement to what was there previously. This actually was my site from a long time ago. This is in Binghamton. This is the confluence of the Shenango and Susquehanna rivers. This was an underutilized property. It had like a couple of retail shops and mostly just pavement and parking lots. We went through the brownfield cleanup program, and it turned into a very viable student housing mixed-use residential building. As I said before, that's the popular redevelopment these days. This one was interesting because of its position at the confluence of the river. I was lucky to see some archaeological work done there. It's when we suspect there might be some cultural significance, like at the confluence of a river, we make sure that we do bring in the archaeological experts, and they do a survey, and they, if they find anything during construction, we stop work, they do their work, and then they say, we're all set here, and they collect their artifacts or do what they do with those, and then we result in a nice new building for the city of Binghamton. One of the gateways I mentioned earlier that allow for more tax credit is renewable energy redevelopments. So here we have a former steel production plant on this is in Buffalo, or it's in Lackawanna, I think, more specifically, and it's on the shoreline of the Erie Lake, Great Lake. And you can see on the right, you can see solar panels up here, and then just around here, there's some wind turbines. So this was if they didn't enter the program, they wouldn't have had maybe perhaps the funding to turn this into a viable renewable energy project. So, should I go into this? Okay. We invited the Department of Health to be here tonight to discuss any health concerns you might have or health questions, and they were unable to join us. So I was asked to display Melissa Dorosky's name. If you can come to me after, I'll leave this up at the end of the talk. I can give you some of her information, and feel free to call or ask if you have any concerns about the contamination in the brownfield opportunity area. She's the person to ask. So I think.
All right, I want to first just thank Kiera and Kaylin for being our panelists this evening. I'm going to move on to the rest of the presentation, but they've both agreed to stick around until we're done in case anybody has any more questions about the topic of contamination and remediation or the brownfield cleanup program. Elka, can you come do the slides? I'm going to stand over here so I'm not hearing myself in an echo because it's very distracting for me to hear myself. So as I mentioned, this is a planning project that's being funded through the Department of State, and it's a planning grant. So in the Midtown Thriving project, we are not doing any of the cleanup. We're not doing any of the development. We are really working with the community to understand the community's needs and wants and putting that together in a report that gets sent to the state, and the state reads that and will designate that area, that geography I showed you earlier, as a BOA, hopefully. And there's many benefits to being in a BOA, which I described earlier, but I just put this planning process up because right now I'm going to be speaking about some of the early findings from the existing conditions and inventory analysis. And so we're right here in phase one. We had our kickoff meeting in April. What we're doing right now is we are collecting data. We've started our community engagement process. And this all comes together in developing a vision for the neighborhood with the community and basically understanding the neighborhood so that we know what's feasible and what the neighborhood needs. And we are also in the process of developing a list of sites, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is all going to end, I realize it's hard to see on this slide, but around November of this year. And then we go into the next phase of our planning process, which is where we're really looking at specific sites, and we're meeting with the community, we're talking with the community about what they want to see on those sites, and we're coming up with development concepts for those sites. We're also going to be talking to the community about other strategies, policies, programs they feel like would help the neighborhood achieve that vision that we set forth in this first phase. That all gets put together into a big report. We present it to the public for feedback. We make revisions based on what we hear from the public, and then we send that to the state. So that's just an overview. Again, in our kickoff meeting, I went into a lot of detail about this. That's available on the website. But I'm just going to talk now about some of these early findings. So in our inventory and analysis of the neighborhood, and we have started to do so, we're looking at demographics, housing needs, existing housing, existing land use and zoning, land ownership patterns, parks and open space, significant buildings and community assets, historic or archaeologically significant areas, transportation systems, infrastructure, natural resources, and environmental features. We are going to be doing an economic and market analysis for the area. And then obviously we're also looking at brownfields, abandoned and vacant sites, and then identifying those strategic sites. And we need community input on those strategic sites. So I'll talk a bit about more of that in a minute. So some of our early findings. This is the estimated population for the neighborhood. The neighborhood, actually, let's go back to the map that shows the neighborhood. It's way at the beach. Okay, so this is the neighborhood. It doesn't align exactly with any known geography, but the way we're doing our analysis is at the block group level and the block level when that data is available. So these are census geographies. Blocks are the smallest geography, but oftentimes we're going to have to do it at the block group level. So there's 5 block groups in the area. And so all the numbers we're looking at are using census data for those block groups. Right, I got that right? Yes, I'm looking at Eric, my colleague, who put much of this data together. So the total population for the area is around a little bit more than 5,000. And as you can see, the neighborhood has a large population that's in their sort of young adult population. There's a fair amount of children under 10, but this doesn't really reflect much of the Hudson Valley has a very different age pyramid where you have a significant older population and a much smaller younger population. And I would say that this neighborhood is not typical for our area in that there's this large percent of people in that young adult age group. So this is just showing race and ethnic data for the study area versus the city at large. The study area is a little bit more diverse than the city at large with a higher percent of Black and African American population and Hispanic and Latino. And this slide is showing the annual household income for the study area versus the city. And Midtown overall has lower household incomes than the city at large. There's a smaller percentage of households making 150,000 or more, and a larger share of households making between 25,000 and 99,000. So income does not just tell you about how much money a household makes, it also tells you about, you know, economic opportunities that those households have access to. It can tell you about services. People with very low incomes oftentimes need higher level of services. So the fact that there's a greater portion of households in Midtown in the lower income range suggests that there's a higher need for services in Midtown. This is a land use map, and this map was created using property tax code data from the tax assessor. So these are the way the data is given. Each property has a code for what its current use is, and we basically look at those and broke them into categories. And as you can see, much of Midtown is residential. The uses are very separated, which has some to do with the fact that until recently, the zoning precluded certain uses in different areas. It was sort of your traditional zoning. The city, as you may be aware, updated their zoning last year to a form-based code, which allows for more mixed uses throughout most of the city. So you can kind of anticipate that this is going to change, where you're going to get more mixed use in different neighborhoods. But this map will also be useful to us when we start looking at specific sites to understand the context of uses around those sites. So this is part of our analysis. This map shows property ownership in Midtown. It's not showing up well on this projection, but most of it, as you can see, is privately owned. There's not a lot of publicly owned land in Midtown. Most of the sites that are colored purple are a school or some kind of county building. This is the rail trail. So most of the land is publicly owned. The next thing we looked at is vacant properties. And these are properties, again, this data comes from the tax assessor data. And so it is indicated as being vacant. It doesn't, you know, there's certainly going to be properties that are not listed as vacant, that are vacant and otherwise, but this is based on that data. There is a fair amount of vacancy in Midtown, according to this map. We are also looking at parking. So these are just properties, again, according to that assessor tax code data, that are listed as parking. However, the amount of parking in Midtown is much greater than this, because if a structure is on the building, it won't be listed as a parking lot. So one of the questions that has come up already, or sort of one of the recommendations rather, is that there's a need for more parks in Midtown. And I just want to say something about the way we're doing our analysis of the neighborhood. We have sort of a list of things that we're looking at, obviously, but it's also an iterative process in that if we hear something from the community, we need parks, we're going to look at that. So this was sort of in response to what we were hearing from the community. And again, you can't see it very well, but there's not very many parks in Midtown. There's this little park on Van Buren, this park here, this one, and this is the, oops. And so the next slide I have shows the walking, not the walking distance. This is a 0.2 mile radius from the parks in Midtown. And you can see that there's areas in the BOA, in this study area, where you're more than 0.2 miles from any park. And if you were to take out the rail trail, you wouldn't see basically anywhere north of Broadway, which is along here, would be outside of the 0.2 radius of any park. So this sort of just confirms what we were hearing, that there's not a lot of parks. Another thing we're looking at is food access, because one of the comments we've heard is that there's not a lot of, there's basically that Midtown, there's a need for a full grocery store in Midtown. So this map includes specialty grocery stores and a deli in Midtown. These are important grocery stores. They're providing food for the community, but it may be expensive to get all of your groceries at a specialty store. So the full grocery store is probably a better option for a lot of people. There is a bus that goes up Broadway and you can access this, but if we look at the next slide, this is a map showing the walk time from that full grocery store. The purple area is showing a 10-minute walk, and the green area is showing a 20-minute walk. So you can see, again, that much of the study area is outside of even a 20-minute walk from a full grocery store. So just to sort of confirm what we've heard, that there is a need for that. So our next steps are, we're going to continue with this analysis and doing this inventory of the BOA study area. But we are also working on selecting sites. And I've gotten a lot of questions about how we do that. So I'm actually going to go back up to a couple slides to show you. Just keep going up to the... Okay, so what we're doing is we have put together a methodology to create a long list of potential sites. And we will be speaking about this at our next sort of public meeting, but our process includes looking at ownership, looking at sites that are vacant, looking at sites that were listed on the DEC or EPA website, or on their lists rather, as contaminated or potentially contaminated sites, looking at sites that are in REM, and also using just sort of community input to develop a list of sites. Did I miss anything there, Eric? No, okay. So these sort of maps that I was showing you is helping us inform that list of sites. And our process is to come up with a long list of sites, and then we're going to start narrowing that down using community input to inform us as to what sites we select as the most sort of important and significant sites for this project. So we can go back to that last slide. Wait, go back up one. Okay, so site selection, and then again, we're continuing with community engagement. We did our first kitchen table meeting last month or earlier this month at the Broadway Bubble. These kitchen table meetings are really, they're supposed to be sort of informal meetings where we go out to the community rather than ask the community to come to a public meeting. We meet the community where they are. We talk about the project and we really try to get input. And right now, as I mentioned, we're really trying to get input towards that community vision. So we have some plans for what we're doing around these kitchen table meetings, but Elka here, if you have any ideas about community partners or venues or any ideas about where we should be doing these and who we should be speaking with, certain communities that maybe are underrepresented, please come to speak to Elka after the meeting. And that, I believe, is my last slide. So I'm going to open it up again to questions. Again, we still have our panelists here if there are further questions about contamination or if you have any questions about anything related to the Midtown Thriving planning project.
So thanks, Kate. Well, that was really terribly annoying. My goodness. So one thing I did want to pick up on just from the last panel and from this is one of the most significant pieces of feedback that we've been receiving from the community is a fear of contributing to the gentrification that's already and the displacement that's already taking place in Midtown. It's very obvious that that is probably number one concern. I just want to note that the tax credits in the way the program was designed in many post-industrial towns, there is a bit of a desperation for development. And so the attractiveness piece is actually, blight is the flip side of gentrification, right? So in some areas, we're seeing massive influx of investment, which contributes to potentially massive displacement. In other areas, we're seeing massive, still, disinvestment, where these tax credits could potentially, bring new life into a place that's really desperate for, jobs and industry and housing, et cetera. Obviously, Kingston is desperate for housing, but is also, from the sense that I'm getting, is desperate to, pump the brakes on the process that's already underway. So I want to just pick up quickly on the language of making a site attractive to developers is not language that we have heard that the community wants here, and is not a process that we ever intend to contribute to. Our intention with the community vision that we are putting together, which is a requirement of the state grant, is to make sure that the community's input, that the community essentially has a seat at the table when we say to developers or property owners or even, public entities that own land, we say, hey, you want to access these tax credits? Well, this is what the community has spoken. And so in Kingston specifically, what the community is speaking is very different from some of the other towns that are just like, please pay attention to us, right? So that felt a little bit like a moment of dissonance that I definitely heard and just wanted to relate to, because it's certainly different from what we've been hearing already. And I just wanted that to be very, very clear that we are hearing that concern. I personally live in Newburgh. I live that concern. I'm a tenant down there. So we see that, we hear that, and just want to make sure that you know that we have heard it. Yes, Minya, hi.
Thank you. I appreciate you addressing that issue, because it doesn't feel like, it's not the sense I'm getting from this room. It's not the sense I'm getting from some of the things in the feedback. A lot of it sounds like make it more like Brooklyn rather than listen and be aware that there was a community here before you that's struggling desperately for housing, struggling desperately, has a lot of homeless issues. And for you to say that's really helpful. One of the hardest things for me to read was in the pre-nom study, was some of the language was very, some of the language was very dog whistle-y. There were terms like change the image of Midtown. And we want things like nut-based milk specialty stores. Doesn't really speak to trying to generate focus on people who are being displaced. Craft beers. And so that tells me that those meetings were already geared ahead of time to say, hey, these things were here before, but now we've got people who are more important that we want to listen to. And that's where this is going to start happening. And so it's very hard to have trust that this process is really going to be geared to the people who need the most focus, and that it's going to be near to the craft beer, nut-based milk people.
Yeah, I mean, I love craft beer and nut-based milk, but I'm also a tenant whose landlady is about to sell her building. So you know, we can be both. But I do want to just relate for a second. In addition to a desperate need for deeply, 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 deeply affordable housing, needs amongst specifically youth who are at risk, mental health, and substance use challenges. Those are really the top concerns that have arisen, and more than anything else. And repeatedly being shared with us. I mean, not just you. I know you and I have talked a lot, but everywhere we go, we were at the Cinco de Mayo event, and we set up a booth there. And again, even there, housing was number one. So we're hearing that, and I understand. I mean, there's a reason why I picked up on that point, right? I understand that the way the program is designed is within a system, right? We talked about this last time, that we are within a system, and we're trying to operate within that system to do the best that we can. There is still room to do the best that we can in a way that meets those needs. And that's why the community engagement is so critical. Because if you come and say, hey, we need youth housing using Ishai vouchers with a youth empowerment center downstairs, well, that's something we have to figure out. Is there a site that can accommodate that? Is there a landowner who is willing to work with us to use their credits to make that happen? Again, one of the really, really hard things about Kingston is that so many of these sites are privately owned. So we've got our work cut out for us in finding the property owners who are willing to do that kind of work, and striking that balance between the financial feasibility of development, which, let's be real, it's expensive. The cleanup is expensive. How do we strike that balance between making sure that something can be developed, meaning it's not pie in the sky, and it's also not craft beer and nut milk? Okay. All right. Thank you.
I want to just a short statement about tax credits. In general, I think they are only a tool for people who pay a lot of taxes, means people who make a lot of income. Anybody else doesn't need a tax credit. And my problem is that when I look at what you do, and it's really great work to involve the neighborhood and everything, but I've been sitting not so long ago over there at the Common Council, and I saw how the Common Council gave a local developer, Bleichman, a grant from the Empire State where he got $2 million for free to develop a school and made no concessions to anything like affordable housing or anything. That was, and I was only there because I was so stupid to apply for that too, without knowing that I'm not a big wig or whatever. But and I'm not saying I hate Mr. Bleichman. He does big hotels or anything like that. But what I found amazing was that this happened, and I fear that the tax thing will do the same thing. I can get for the plot of land we are trying to develop as a non-for-profit now, I'm sure I can get a developer who wants to build apartment houses there in a split second, and I wouldn't have to do anything. So I don't know why there's no other incentives. For example, cheap loans, local banks would be a good thing. I can't get any. cheap loans, yeah, for building something up, or specific help for specific projects once they're approved by the community and the neighborhood. And you say, okay, for that you get something or a reduction. And so this is not addressed to you necessarily because I think you do a good job. But in general, what does all of what you do help when then it goes into this chamber over there? And then there's people awarded who answer questions of like, do you do something like affordable housing? No. Oh, we give you the grant.
Let me try to answer that first, and I might ask Susan's help. So I think what your question is, I mean, I think you're sort of making the statement that this tax credit component of the BOA planning process isn't going to help the small people at all. And I think there's probably some truth to that. But within the BOA plan, it is our intention to include the site concepts is one part of the plan. But in the first meeting, I gave some examples of other BOAs where they include policies and programs that actually have been formally adopted by those communities as policy and programs. And so we have an opportunity in this plan to create a neighborhood plan that could include a loan program for small businesses, potentially. I mean, I don't know. We need to have conversations with the city and with the community about what's feasible and what the community wants. But some of the other, just for an example, I'm having a hard time remembering some of the programs that they included, but I think there was one on, I'm looking at Susan. I'm going to have to go back and look at it. We can talk about this afterwards. It's in my last presentation, and I'm happy to link to those examples. But yeah, this planning project is not going to solve the issues that you're talking about. And I don't want to make false promises that it is. And it's true, the tax credit will benefit, the bigger the development, the more they're going to stand to benefit. However, they do have to align their projects with the community vision. And so that's the teeth, that's the lever we have, is coming up with that strong community vision and coming up with those concept plans. And I would suggest to the community that we be very explicit and very clear in our vision and ask as much as we can to make sure that that actually means something. So if we're not specific, then it's going to be left to interpretation. But if we're specific about what that vision is, then that's really the only lever we have. I see.
Yeah. Sure. So one of the things Kate was saying about the BCP. Oh, I'm Susan Lanford. I'm with the New York State Department of State, and so I help manage the grant from the state side. I think the BCP program that does apply to brownfield contaminated sites and that have to be deemed eligible by DEC to go through that. And then being in the BOA, a designated BOA, entitles them to a potential bump up in the tax credit. So there is a tax credit that's separate from this, but the BOA allows for an additional tax credit. And yes, I don't think myself or Kira would say this is a complex process. Doing brownfield remediation and redevelopment is a complex process. And so that does require a variety of skill sets to come in from a potential developer. I don't think anyone's going to deny that this is a tough thing to do, but that's why some of the tax credits are there, because it is a very tough and complex thing to do, and it is very costly. For some of the other benefits, and I think Kate referenced them earlier and she talked more about them in the first presentation, is this BOA plan is a neighborhood plan. It does allow for thinking about policy ideas that may be related to helping with loans for, businesses or other development. It can also be about thinking about how do we do better streets, infrastructure, things of that nature. And then it does make this area eligible for additional funds to help explore some of those potential policy or infrastructure ideas. So the tax credit is a piece of it, but this is a process and a program that is about neighborhood revitalization and redevelopment, but with thinking about what Alka and others have said, is thinking about what is the vision of this community and what we're going to be finding out in the coming months. This is not about displacement or replacement or anything. This is about the community and really helping to realize the vision that the community has for itself.
I'm going to have you speak into the online audience can hear you.
Isn't this where the new zoning comes in? Because this is all going to be built within the context of the new zoning. So all the work that was put into that, it's not like anything that will be built here will be just its own little island. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, so I think the new zoning, and I might let Bartek speak to this if he'd like, certainly creates a lot of opportunities because it allows for new uses, it allows for higher density, which when you're sort of trying to meet housing needs is a very important component of making that happen. And I'll let Bartek speak to that.
Yeah, but you're right. Any project would still have to conform to the zoning or any other land use requirement that the city would have. Yeah, it doesn't. Those rules are still in place. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the timing of this project with the zoning is great in a way because sometimes BOAs are used to do zoning updates. That's not uncommon, where the community sort of comes up with a vision and then that leads to zoning update. But since the city just went through that process, we can really focus our planning efforts on other things, which is great, sort of trusting that the community's already gone through this process for the zoning.
When you said selecting sites, so you're talking about sites for redevelopment or affordable housing, but I mean, these would be sites on the market, or I'm just confused about what sites and how many.
Yeah, so I did go into detail about this in the last presentation, which is why I rushed through it a little bit in this one. But there was a pre-nomination study done in 2019. The county looked at 5 different neighborhood or areas in the county. I'm just moving away from the echo. And Midtown was one of those areas. And they actually came up with a list of sites. And these are sites that were vacant. They were listed as vacant. They were tax delinquent, or they were DEC or EPA sites. We basically have taken that list, we've updated it using updated information, and then we're adding to that list some parking lots that we know are very underutilized. We're adding to it sites that the community might tell us, there's this site, it is just sitting there empty, it really should be this. We might look at those sites. So the first stage is developing a longer list of sites and then whittling it down. And again, I'm not going to go into our methodology today because I'm just not prepared to do that, but I will in our next public meeting. And then going out to the community, once we've sort of come up with a shorter list of sites and actually coming up with development concepts for those sites. And then those concepts get put together in the report. This is going to be a publicly available document. The city can send that out to potentially developers. Part of our process for identifying sites is identifying property owners who are interested in participating in this process. So if a property owner is like, no, I don't want anything to do with you, we're going to cross that site off because it's not going to be a possibility. But so far, we've already reached out to some property owners and we've heard from some people like, yes, I'm interested in being part of this process. I want to know, you know, they also see that the site that maybe they own is just sitting there as an empty parking lot. They understand that there's needs in the community and they want their site to be part of that. And maybe they also see there's some potential personal benefit for them, of course. I'm not going to deny that, but those are the sites. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I apologize if I have missed some of this, but it seems to me that you have this whole area, and then you have the sites that you've identified that and some of them are contaminated and some aren't, but they're abandoned or whatever you want to use. But have you done a thorough examination to find all the contaminated sites?
Okay, so in this planning process, we will not be doing a thorough examination of all the contaminated sites. But what we will be doing, so the way environmental assessment is done is they typically do what's called a phase one. They don't typically, they do a phase one and then a phase two. And the phase one is where you look at any historical or current use of that site that would lead you to suspect that there's contamination on that site. So we're not going to do phase ones for every property in Midtown. We don't have the resources to do that. However, that short list of sites that we come up with, we will be checking the historical records on those sites. We are not going to do complete phase ones again because we don't have the resources to do that, but we will be checking them and saying, we think there may be something here because this used to be a auto body shop, right? And so that will go into our sort of report on those sites and our understanding of those sites. Then following this BOA designation, those sites, the property owners, if there's suspicion on those sites, they would go for and pay for the phase one. The phase two is after they've sort of identified the likely contamination on a site. A phase two is where they actually do the testing on that site. It's expensive. So one of the benefits of being in a BOA is there's actually funding for those phase two assessments. So that can be a barrier actually, is a property owner doesn't want to pay for the phase twos because it can be upwards to $100,000, I think. And so they just sit on it and wait. But because of the BOA designation, they're more likely to go through the phase two and understand the contamination. So one of the benefits of this project is actually understanding the contamination and moving forward with dealing with it and not just continuing to live without that knowledge.
Kate, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, please.
So we've talked a lot about the brownfields program through the DEC, where you get the tax credits. But just to follow up on what you were saying, the EPA also has a grant program. Any municipalities can apply for it, non-for-profits, like economic development corporations, that type of organizations can apply for the grant, EPA grant program. And we had worked with the city on they won a grant, an assessment grant back in 2018. And they can certainly apply for another one. It depends on the type of grant you apply for. You can use the funding to do assessments, just the phase one assessment, the phase two assessments that Kate was just mentioning. They also have cleanup grants. So if you have known contamination on a site and you need to address it and clean it up so that it can be remediated and reused, they have those type of grants. They have revolving loan grants. So, you know, an entity will get, the municipality or whoever applies gets a good chunk of money to loan out to small business owners or to people that want to redevelop these sites. So it's not just the state program, there's also federal programs that are out there. So I just wanted to mention that.
Do we have any questions online? No, okay. Any other questions from our audience? Let me, and then you.
I don't know if this is relevant or not, but to what this gentleman was talking about with the gentrification and prices going up and all that. Most of gentrification, if I understand it right, what happens is the property values go up, then the property taxes go up, and that's when people have to leave. Is that pretty much the way it works? And rents and stuff. So I noticed that there was a large percentage of white there, which was owner housing and stuff. How much of that housing is actually owner occupied and how much is rental? And I guess, you know, when you talk about giving tax credits and stuff, if it's owner occupied by somebody who is grandfathered in based on that, would you ever lock in a tax rate for that person, even though the property is going up in value, because then they won't be kicked out or have to leave because they can't pay the taxes?
So I'm not sure the percentage, Eric may be looking it up right now, but I know that Midtown does have a higher portion of renters than owners. I can't tell you exactly what it is off the top of my head. It will be, we will know that next time we meet. And I'm going to let Elka answer the other question.
So I think what you're referring to is a property tax credit, which is a local option or exemption, I should say, for people who are longtime owners. We could talk about property taxation for the next several hours. I love talking about property tax because of how we do it and how we should be doing it are two very different things. This is not that. We're not talking about the property tax mechanisms, the exemptions and credits that we have for any given municipality to opt in order to support long-term homeowners, in order to support, there are exemptions for veterans, there are exemptions for seniors, there are all kinds of exemptions, right? Exemptions for different types of use. What we do not have in this state, and this is some of the advocacy that we do very separate from this project, some of the advocacy that we do is to advocate for fair taxation that relates to a person's income. It could relate to longevity. In some cases, there are property tax exemptions that relate to community land trusts. That is something that could be explored in Kingston, considering that there is a new community land trust at this point. And if any of the, if the community land trust begins to acquire properties, of course, the local governments, meaning all of the taxing jurisdictions, so that's the city, the school, the fire, the library, the county, every single property taxing jurisdiction needs to adopt this property tax exemption. So this project is not that. And so, ideally not, right?
It does, whether you say it or not, it does.
Okay,
Get development in, and you get higher things, and you get, it will do gentrification. There's no way it's not.
So I just want to make a distinction between gentrification and displacement, first of all. So gentrification is when you sort of see new, yeah. So, that is a real fear that is real, and we acknowledge that fear. And I'm just going to say the planning team on this project does not want to see that happen. I'm telling you with all my heart. So there's a couple solutions. Yeah, agreed. Agreed. So let me respond to that question. There's different solutions to prevent displacement. One is you create more housing opportunities so that there's more places for people to live. And those housing opportunities need to be attainable, which means they need to be at a price that people can access them. So do you want to say it in the mic? Because I think your comment's valuable and I want people to hear it. But what she's saying is that we need housing opportunities for the people who are here. And we agree. So I think as a community, there is a toolbox of strategies to do that. And in one of our later sessions, we're going to be presenting those ideas with the community so that we can talk about strategies that we should adopt and utilize in order to, yeah.
I want to address one thing. This came up last time, and we did enter into a discussion last time, last public meeting about this, but I do want to answer your one question. You asked who is responsible for gentrification and displacement?
Well, the displacement. Who's going to make sure that people who are renting in these houses
right
now?
Okay, so here, totally. Okay. Last I checked, we lived in a highly capitalist system. In this country, housing is seen as a commodity. It's related to as a commodity. How to change the rules of the game such that we prioritize stable communities where people can live in their homes long periods of time, and we can't extract value from people who are working really hard just to stay where they are and support their kids, et cetera, et cetera. If you answer that question for me, you're hired. There is no answer for who is responsible for gentrification and displacement. Who in the city can adopt policies for anti-displacement housing policies. The housing director of the city of Kingston is here now, but ultimately, the people who can make that decision are your council members. Okay. And of course, I'm always happy to have that conversation about what kinds of policies can be adopted to support Emergency Tenant Protection Act. Rent control was recently adopted in Kingston. I'm not totally familiar with how that process is going. That is one tool that we have at our disposal. There are many others, but again, those are the types of resolutions that your council members could adopt. We can explore, and we are planning to explore, anti-displacement strategies that are relevant, that are feasible, that local leaders are open to. That is part of what we plan to bring to the forefront. So I hope that answers your question. I love your questions. I love all the questions about gentrification and displacement because it's the nut that we all want to crack. So thank you for that.
I wanted to ask one more thing.
I wanted to make a comment. Oh, sorry. Comment on what you were saying, because I'm glad you brought that up. And I think it's very important to acknowledge, Elka and Kate, you guys are great. Pattern for Progress is great, but you guys are not the only players in this game. And I think that it's very important to recognize that when you say who is responsible for making sure displacement does not happen in Midtown Kingston, I think the correct answer is every player that is a part of this project that is developing, revamping. So that means all of the players in the game have to be on the same page that you guys are saying to us, or we can't trust that displacement isn't going to be made. So that also means housing, right? I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot, housing director, but what's your vision, what's your idea, what's your value about the housing in Kingston right now, right? So what is your intention as the housing director, part of this program, to make sure displacement does not happen in Midtown Kingston for the residents that are already here? And I think that's kind of like what you were saying. We get the policies and procedures to make the world go round, but where we live today, there's money being thrown in this community, and how the people that are involved heavy in making decisions, that are sitting at that table to figure out where the money is going, you guys are the ones responsible to make sure that we do not have displacement in our community.
I mean, I'd love to have a conversation with you about all the housing stuff that's happening in the city of Kingston. We just passed a big new zoning code. The goal of that zoning code was to make housing legal again in the city of Kingston and make housing development of all kinds possible in the city of Kingston in ways that weren't possible before. We did adopt the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. We're the only upstate municipality to have adopted ETPA, which is rent stabilization and rent control in the city of Kingston. We're considering opting into good cause eviction, which would mean that all tenants in the city of Kingston have the right to a lease renewal. Managing millions of dollars of grants to encourage housing development and housing affordability in the city of Kingston. And the BOA project focusing on Midtown, is a part of the housing priorities that I'm focusing on. So there's a lot, but there's big challenges. But I think we're making progress based on, some of the things the city has recently passed. That's a short answer. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the question was, when new housing is coming in, how can we ensure that those rents, right, those rents are actually attainable to the residents of the city of Kingston? You know, we don't have the power as a municipality to control rents in new development. But what we do know is that by adding housing of all kinds, rents overall can stabilize. We also know that there are a lot of programs that we can connect to encourage the kind of housing that we need, right? So there are all kinds of state and federal subsidies out there. And if we can find someone that wants to do a project to build affordable housing, right? My goal is to connect them with the resources to actually make that possible, right? Because it takes a lot of money to build new housing, but there's a lot of resources out there. So what incentives can I give to an individual to say to an interested party, hey, there's this great program, we're looking for a partner, you know, please develop the kind of housing that we actually need. So the zoning code also requires a certain percentage of affordable housing in a new development, right? So there's a certain mandate as part of any housing that is approved. Sure, apart from that, what we can do is ensure that the right incentives, right, are aligned and people understand the programs that are out there to help make the housing that we know we need. And this project, right, is part of that, right? Setting community vision for Midtown. Pattern is going to be doing analysis of the kind of housing that we actually need, right, for the people of Midtown and the city of Kingston. Short answer, yeah. That's, yeah.
I want to, this is a wonderful conversation. I want to let our panelists go because it's late. So I'm going to officially close the meeting, but we will stick around to converse with anyone who has further questions. I want to first thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Kaylin and Kiera, as well as Amanda. And yeah, we will be, if you did not sign up, please sign up so that you receive our mailings. We will keep you informed as to our next public meetings and any community engagement. There's also an opportunity up front to give us your thoughts. We are actively working on this vision piece. So if you want to come and write something, it will be this will be part of our process in developing this vision. So we will have many opportunities to do that. But if you have thoughts today and want to leave anything, please do so. And that's it. Thank you all very much.
You know what? We could hear it when you're sitting up there. I was like, that's strange. Just so, like,